Hi, everyone. This is Scott Nybakken for Dynamite Entertainment, and I'm here with acclaimed writer David Pepose, author of Dynamite's upcoming new series, Space Ghost. David, thanks for joining us on the channel.
Of course, Scott. Thanks so much for having me.
So first off, to give the viewers some background, can you give us a capsule history of how you came to work on this title and the very extensive, as I know, research that you put into it?
Yeah, I've been involved with Dynamite for a long time. I've known Nick Barucci for almost 15 years, going all the way back to my comics journalism days. And so when I made the leap into becoming a writer, I would always keep Nick and Dynamite informed of every book that I'd have coming out. I'd email Nick, I'd email editor Nate Cosby, and I'd say, hey, I've got this new title coming out. I've got this new title coming out. And I have done a lot of work recently over at Marvel, books like Savage Avengers, Moon Knight City of the Dead, and most recently Punisher. And those books, I think, really kind of got me on Dynamite's radar. And so Nate passed my work over to editor Joe Rybant, and they all thought Space Ghost would be a really great fit for this guy, having written a Cape Crusader over in Moon Knight. And having done such a deep dive into the lore of Space Ghost, the thing that struck me immediately was just the immense potential of the character. That for those who aren't familiar with Space Ghost as a character, or who only know him as a talk show host from coast to coast, Space Ghost is a character who reminds me in a lot of ways of Batman by way of Flash Gordon. He's a Cape Crusader who, instead of just patrolling one city, really has to stop criminals and hijackers and pirates across the entire galaxy. He's
Right.
aided by his three sidekicks, teenagers Jan and Jace, and their pet monkey Blip, as well as an arsenal of amazing technology, including his power bands, which give him control over fire, ice, and lasers. His force fields in his power bands, as well as his inviso belt, which allows him to turn invisible. Uh, Space Ghost was created by the legendary Alex Toth, and you can see the amount of care and immense imagination that is thrown into every single concept. And so when I was offered this project, I was just so bowled over by the just immense amount of cool stuff that's never really been explored in the comics medium. And so that's what I'm so excited about with this project is we're really able to do a deeper dive than what the 5 minute cartoons were able to do. And we're able to kind of channel that energy and excitement and those vibes and really dig even deeper than anyone's been able to go before.
Yeah, and like as you said, like Space Ghost started as an animated TV serial in the '60s, and since then the character has been revived in various different ways, a lot of which are starkly different from the original, like you said, like the Space Ghost Coast to Coast show. Um, so how did this affect your approach to the character, and what are some of the bigger changes that you're going to be bringing to the character in and his world?
Yeah, it is definitely my introduction to Space Ghost was in Space Ghost Coast to Coast. I grew up in the 90s, and so that Cartoon Network show, that was my original my thought for Space Ghost. And it wasn't until I got my start in the industry. My breakout was I was an intern at DC Comics back in
Mhm.
2008. And it was then that I started to learn more about comics history and some of the legendary figures in the business. And Alex Toth was one of those names. And I got a copy of Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's Space Ghost trade when I was at DC. And I think between learning about Alex Toth and reading that trade, I suddenly realized, oh, this isn't just a talk show host. He actually was a serious hero in his own right. And so for me, what I really wanted to do, the original Space Ghost, having rewatched every single episode from the original '60s run as well as the '80s revival, as well as every comics appearance that I could get my hands on. That was very much a product of its time. It very much channeled the sort of Adam West camp of 1960s because it did come out in the same year. And so for me, it was how do we kind of honor that original vision, but bring it into the year 2024? How do we kind of reclaim that original superhero vibe that has so much untapped potential to it? So for me, it's not even so much making changes; it's just about adding context. For example, I would say Space Ghost has an amazing bench of iconic villains. Zorak, Metalis, Brack, Creature King, the Widow, Moltar, the Council of Doom, and many, many more. And so for me, it was just how do we add more context in the same way that, say, Batman the Animated Series added context to characters like Mr. Freeze, or Killer Croc. And so that was what we were having a lot of fun with. Also, with these characters, I think it's just about how do we approach them in as character driven and dramatic a way as possible. And so the through line of our series is going to be about Space Ghost's ongoing dynamic with his sidekicks, Jan, Jason, Blip. You'll see from our very first issue how do they each come into each other's orbits and how these twins wind up evolving from being just orphaned rescues to becoming trusted partners and sidekicks in their own right to something that's eventually a found family that gives Space Ghost his reason to live.
Yeah, as you said, the original '60s episodes are extremely short. They're like 5 minutes long, so there was never a lot of screen time spent on like character development or world building, which I imagine is like gives you a lot of freedom to actually
Yeah.
do all that kind of stuff. Without giving like too many spoilers, what are some of the things that the readers can look forward to in like these the first issues, the first couple of
Uh,
issues?
Sure. Well, the way that I wound up approaching Space Ghost and his universe is it's always a question of scale. The universe is a big place, and unfortunately, the Galactic Patrol, they're never going to be able to stop crime everywhere that it happens. There are going to be pirates and hijackers who take advantage of this, and they're going to pick off distant colonies, and that's where Space Ghost operates. He operates sort of in the distant margins of the universe, trying to stop pirates from inflicting the same tragedies that marred his own life. But yeah, we're going to see some really cool villains starting up. You can see even from our original Ash Can that came out just last week that we've got Tanzit, Brago, One Eye, and Lurker showing up as a pirate gang. And as you'll see, Space Ghost is going to make pretty short work out of them. But we've got some other villains waiting in the wings in issue one, an iconic Space Ghost villain that I think a lot of fans are going to be really excited to see. For me, it's all about just how do we add new and interesting wrinkles to all these characters? For example, somebody like Zorak, how do we really kind of play him up as, a figure who his view is almost a little alien to somebody like Space Ghost. This is a living praying mantis, and how would his perspective differ from somebody like Space Ghost, and how do we really reinforce him as Space Ghost's most sadistic arch nemesis? Or somebody like Brack, for example, who I'm very taken with that character because he's not somebody who's trying to take over the universe. He's just a guy trying to get paid. He's a dirty space pirate who just wants to knock over the next gold shipment. And so, how do we kind of add an interesting wrinkle to him that allows us to organically populate him in Space Ghost's universe? The thing that I'm so excited about with this series is that we really are kind of doing the world tour of Space Ghost villains. Dynamite has been so generous and given us a really nice runway for this series. This is going to be my longest run to date. And there are so many villains that we're going to be tapping in this that both newcomers and longtime Space Ghost fans alike are going to find a lot to love.
Oh, that sounds awesome. And which reminds me, how is the series going to be set up in terms of like story arcs? Is it going to focus on like self-contained stories, or will there be multi-issue arcs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our primary focus is going to be self-contained stories, and I thought that was a really important choice to make. I think a lot of my favorite books out in the stands right now are doing a lot of these done-in-one stories, where if you're a reader and you want to pick up an issue of Space Ghost, you will get a self-contained Space Ghost story. You'll get a satisfying chunk. That allows us also to hit as many of these iconic villains as we can, but also it then gives any two-parters or even the occasional three-parter extra punch. We're saving our two-parters for the biggest and baddest of Space Ghost villains for when we really want to put Space Ghost on his heels. But I think for a series, especially for a character who many people aren't familiar with the original 60s run, or they only know him from Coast to Coast, by doing these self-contained done-in-one storylines, we're able to kind of rack up those adventures very quickly and get readers invested in the character. And also, I think it's a nice challenge for me as a writer is that we're able to say every issue we're going to introduce a brand new villain, but also every issue we're going to keep evolving Space Ghost's dynamic. And as we're going to see him going from being this kind of lone figure of the cosmos to becoming almost a begrudging father figure, and then eventually kind of a team player in his own right. So it's a really nice way to write these stories, and I think echoing an earlier point that you said, because there was no pre-established backstory, because there was no continuity, it's a very freeing kind of project. Dynamite and Warner Brothers have been really wonderful in giving me a lot of latitude in how we are interpreting these characters, and they're really letting us kind of run with the ball in the most dynamic and character-driven way.
Yeah, and the Space Ghost himself, of course, doesn't possess any innate superpowers, but as a character, he does follow a lot of superhero conventions with the mask and the cape and the secret lair and the kid sidekicks. As someone who's written a lot of superhero stories, like what qualities from the genre do you think you carried over to the new series?
Boy, that's a great question. A lot of it is pacing. It's like, how do you bring an action sequence to life? And that's something that I always have a lot of fun doing. It's also, how do you hit these character moments? How do you have these moments where you really fall in love with the characters? You can't just lean on the spectacle of it all. You have to really root everything in the character. But also, I think a really fun thing that I did with this series was I really kind of had to wrap my mind around how does Space Ghost work? Just as a character, he's got such an immense array of powers. Like I said, he's got the power bands, he's got the Inviso belt. He's a character who I think shares a lot of DNA with characters like Batman and Superman, but also even characters like Iron Man or the Punisher. And so for me, I was thinking, okay, like how do the power bands work? For example, one of them manipulates temperature and the other one manipulates atmospheric pressure. And that kind of it gives you a way to say, okay, that's how he manipulates fire or ice or lasers, or this is how he does his force field beams. Or his Invisobelt, which refracts the visible wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's how he goes around being invisible. Being able to do these sorts of things, I think, gives it a little bit more of a tactile element. And that way, also, we can kind of show Space Ghost's limitations. What happens when the tech is not available, or what happens when his tech fails him? He's going to have to get by on his wit and his grit. And I think that's a really cool place to put these characters. And it gives us a lot of fun things for the characters to do, but also gives me lots of room to put them in jeopardy as needed. Um, yeah, I think also it's the villains. I think finding the different archetypes of villains, and I'm a guy who a lot of my work is mashups from my very first book, Spencer and Locke, and so being able to say Metalis, I see him as a guy who is kind of like Doctor Doom by way of General Zod by way of Bane. Being able to kind of mash all these archetypes together, especially from the characters that I grew up loving and reading, it's a really fun exercise, and I think it's allowing us to really add some really cool stuff to some really amazing iconic villains.
Yeah, and finally, like we've talked a lot about the villains here. Would you say you had a favorite villain for Space Ghost?
Boy, that is so tough. I'll give you a small spoiler in that I'm writing Zorak right now, and he has been such a fun villain to write. I have a lot of I have a lot of affection for many of these villains. Creature King is such like a weird little guy. I just he's a fun one. Brack, I really love his voice. Again, he's a villain who almost strikes me as blue collar, and very different from the universe conquerors that Space Ghost typically fights. Metalis is another fun one. He's somebody I'm very much looking forward to writing. He's got a lot of fun stuff. But yeah, the thing that I've really enjoyed about this series is every villain I've written so far, they find a way to surprise me. For example, a character like the Widow, seeing the way that she interacts with Jan as the only girl on that squad. Um, it's really fun to kind of like feel these characters out and find these unexpected connections. Um, Yeah, Alex Toth, I owe the man so much, because really he didn't there were no duds. He just let out fastball after fastball with these characters. And for me, I take that as a huge honor, but also an immense responsibility to really kind of bring everything I've got to these characters and really try to introduce them to a brand new generation.
But we're all really looking forward to seeing this. So thanks for calling us all the way from Ghost Planet to talk about the series. The first issue of Space Ghost hits comic stores on May 1st, so make sure that you pre-order it now. And don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for watching.